When a head of state draws a line, the reaction often reveals more than the line itself. In early August 2026, Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before national television cameras in Ouagadougou and made a declaration that was, in one sense, nothing new. Burkina Faso is a secular state. Its constitution, adopted in 1991 and reaffirmed through multiple political transitions, guarantees freedom of religion and explicitly separates religious law from civil governance. Traoré was not announcing a constitutional amendment, he was restating a founding principle. Yet the speech ignited something. It traveled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within days, a Nigerian Islamic cleric, Sheikh Ahmad Gumi, published a response on his Facebook page that dismissed Traoré as inexperienced, naive, and too young to understand the society he governs. Gumi warned that such declarations would give extremists the weapon they need to recruit more fighters against what he called Traoré's secular regime. The message was blunt. A leader of a nation that is roughly 63% Muslim, according to demographic estimates, should not be so unequivocal about keeping religious law out of state affairs. What makes this exchange significant is not the disagreement itself. Heads of state and religious figures clash routinely across Africa, across the world. What matters is the underlying question the exchange forces into the open. When a West African leader in a Muslim-majority country refuses to accommodate the political ambitions of Islamist movements, who is he actually protecting? And whose interests are being defended by those who tell him to soften his position? The conventional framing of this story positions it as a confrontation between a secular military leader and conservative religious forces. But that framing misses the central reality that Traoré himself articulated in his response. The rejection of an Islamist political agenda is not primarily a fight for Christians, for animists, or for the non-religious. It is first a fight for Muslims. Muslims who pray 5 times a day, who fast during Ramadan, who give zakat, but who do not accept that their faith requires them to live under a particular interpretation of Sharia enforced by the state. These are the people that jihadist groups in the Sahel have killed in large numbers. In northern Nigeria, in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina Faso itself, the victims of so-called Islamist violence are overwhelmingly Muslim civilians who refuse to submit to the militants' version of religious authority. This is not rhetoric. The data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project shows that across the central Sahel, civilian fatalities attributed to Jamaat Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara have consistently included Muslim communities that resisted the group's territorial control, tax demands, and justice systems. The jihadist strategy in rural Burkina Faso has followed a pattern seen elsewhere. Enter a community, declare the state absent or illegitimate, offer security and dispute resolution through Sharia courts, punish those who appeal to the formal justice system, and brand as apostates any who refuse. Muslim farmers, Muslim herders, Muslim village elders, Muslim women who reject forced marriages, all have been targets. So when Ibrahim Traoré says that Sharia law will never be imposed in Burkina Faso, he is not delivering a message to the Vatican or to Western human rights organizations. He is speaking to the millions of Burkinabe Muslims who want a functioning state that protects their physical security, their property, and their right to practice their faith without armed groups dictating what that practice must look like. Sheikh Gumi's intervention deserves scrutiny on its own terms. Gumi is not an obscure figure. He is a prominent Kaduna-based cleric who has served as an intermediary between the Nigerian government and armed groups, including bandit networks and Boko Haram factions, across multiple administrations. He has advocated for dialogue, for amnesty, and at times for negotiated settlements that critics argue have given militant groups time to regroup. His public statements have included calls for Nigeria to adopt elements of Sharia more broadly, and he has frequently framed government military operations as provocations that escalate violence rather than contain it. The core of Gumi's criticism of Traoré rests on a strategic claim. He argues that a secular leader governing a Muslim-majority population cannot afford to antagonize Islamists outright, because doing so makes recruitment easier for extremist groups. In Gumi's framework, public declarations against Sharia are tactical errors that hand propaganda victories to insurgents. The implication is that a more pragmatic leader would remain ambiguous, would negotiate behind closed doors, and would avoid forcing militants into a corner. There is a logic to this argument. Insurgent groups do exploit government rhetoric for recruitment. The Islamic State in the Greater Sahara has framed its campaign as a defense of Islam against a Western-backed secular state. Harsh government statements can be clipped, translated, and distributed through messaging channels that reach rural populations already skeptical of the state. Any communication strategy carries risk, but the counter-argument, and the one that Traoré's response represents, is that ambiguity carries a greater risk. If the state will not clearly say that the constitution will not be replaced by religious law, then what is the state actually defending? If a leader in Ouagadougou cannot affirm that all citizens, regardless of faith, stand equally before the same legal system, then what distinguishes the state from the insurgent groups competing for legitimacy? And if the political class signals privately that it might be willing to bargain away secularism under sufficient pressure, then that signal eventually reaches the very groups it was meant to placate. There is historical context here that extends beyond Burkina Faso. Multiple countries in the Sahel and West Africa have grappled with the relationship between religious law and state authority for decades. Northern Nigeria introduced expanded Sharia penal codes in 12 states beginning in 1999, a political decision that was partly a response to popular demand and partly a product of elite negotiation. The results have been complex. In some areas, Sharia courts provided faster and more accessible justice than the overburdened formal system. In others, the politicization of religious law deepened communal divisions and provided rhetorical cover for extremist recruitment. What did not happen, despite 2 decades of expanded Sharia, was the pacification of Boko Haram or the resolution of northern Nigeria's security crisis. The insurgency grew more lethal, not less, during the years when the state was most accommodating to religious legal demands. Mali offers another instructive case. In 2012, after the collapse of state control in the north, jihadist groups immediately established their version of Sharia governance in Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal. They amputated limbs, destroyed shrines, and enforced dress codes. Local Muslims resisted, fled, or endured. The international community eventually intervened militarily, but the precedent was set. Once the state vacates a space, alternative systems fill it, and those systems are not subject to negotiation once they are entrenched. Traoré appears to have studied these examples. His response to Gumi was sharp and personal. "Come to Burkina Faso and tell me I am a small boy," he said. "Come and force me to implement Sharia law." The phrasing was deliberately confrontational. It signaled that this administration will not treat Sharia advocacy as a legitimate political position requiring engagement. It will treat it as a threat to the constitutional order. Whether this approach will improve security outcomes in Burkina Faso is an open question. The country is enduring one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. The United Nations estimates that over 2 million people are internally displaced. Jihadist groups control, or contest, large portions of territory in the north and east. The military government has made security its primary justification for remaining in power beyond the timeline originally envisioned for a democratic transition. If the security situation does not improve, Traoré's tough rhetoric on Sharia will be judged alongside his government's counterinsurgency record. Words alone do not defeat armed movements. But there is a dimension of this story that transcends the immediate security calculation. It concerns what kind of state Burkina Faso intends to be. Traoré's speech articulated a vision of citizenship that is not defined by religious identity. The country belongs to all of its citizens, irrespective of their religious beliefs, he said. This is the language of the 1991 Constitution, but it is also the language of Thomas Sankara, who 30 years earlier had declared that the Burkinabe Revolution would not be built on mosques or churches, but on schools, clinics, and productive labor. The Sankara parallel is frequently drawn by Traoré's supporters, and the captain himself has invoked Sankara's legacy repeatedly. But there is an important difference in context. Sankara governed a Burkina Faso that was not yet under assault from transnational jihadist networks. His secularism was radical in its time, banning forced marriages, promoting women's education, and sidelining traditional chiefs and religious authorities. But he was not fighting a war against insurgents who explicitly frame their violence as religious obligation. Traoré is making the same principled argument about secularism while under direct military attack from groups that call his government apostate. This is what makes Sheikh Gumi's advice so revealing. Gumi effectively argued that a leader under Islamist attack should moderate his secularism to avoid provoking further attacks. Traoré's response, in substance, was that moderating secularism in response to jihadist violence is not moderation, it is surrender. And surrender does not pacify. It invites more demands. The unspoken dimension of this exchange is Nigeria itself. Nigeria is Africa's most populous nation, its largest economy, and a country where the relationship between religious identity and state power remains deeply contested. Gumi is a Nigerian actor speaking about a Burkinabe leader, but his argument reflects a distinctly Nigerian debate about how to manage religious pluralism under conditions of insurgency. Traoré's blunt rejection of that debate's premises is a challenge not just to Gumi, but to an entire political approach that has shaped Nigerian security policy for years. For the rest of West Africa, the Traoré-Gumi exchange serves as a live case study. If a military leader in Ouagadougou can hold the line on secularism while fighting a jihadist insurgency, then the argument that security requires religious accommodation loses some of its force. If he cannot, if the insurgency continues to gain ground despite his rhetoric, then critics will argue that ideological clarity is no substitute for effective counterinsurgency strategy. What is clear is that Traoré has made his choice. He has chosen to define the state by what it is, a secular republic with equal citizenship, rather than by what it is not, a theocracy. He has chosen to address the Muslim majority of Burkina Faso not as a religious bloc whose leaders must be accommodated, but as citizens whose security and dignity the state is obligated to protect. And he has chosen to respond to a foreign cleric's condescension not with diplomatic nicety, but with direct challenge. Whether these choices strengthen or weaken Burkina Faso's position will be determined not by speeches, but by developments on the ground in the months and years ahead. The jihadist groups operating in the Sahel are not going to disband because a head of state gave a good speech. They are going to test whether the state can actually hold territory, deliver basic services, and offer rural populations a credible alternative to the parallel governance structures the militants have been building for years. But what Traoré's speech did, and what the reaction to it confirms, is that the ideological dimension of the Sahel conflict cannot be wished away by tactical silence. The question of whether the state's constitution, or a militant's interpretation of religious law, governs a village, a province, or a nation, is not a secondary issue. It is the core of the conflict. And on that question, Traoré has now eliminated any ambiguity about where his government stands. The response from certain quarters in Nigeria suggests that this clarity is, for some, deeply uncomfortable. The reasons for that discomfort merit their own examination. But for the Burkinabe state, the path forward has been stated plainly. There will be no Sharia law. The constitution stands, and the fight to defend it continues. The question that remains is whether the rest of the region will watch, learn, and draw its own conclusions, or whether the old arguments about pragmatism and accommodation will continue to shape policy even as the evidence of their failure accumulates. Ibrahim Traoré has made his bet. The Sahel is watching.